What's going on, analysts? Welcome to another episode of our All About Analysis YouTube channel. In this channel, we interview experts in crime analysis, academics, and law enforcement leaders. Let's go ahead and get started. Today's guest is Dr. Margo Watt, a professor of psychology at St. Francis Xavier University and an adjunct professor at Dalhousie University. She's a registered and practicing clinical forensic psychologist. She also worked at the Correctional Services of Canada in some capacity for some 25 years, conducting forensic risk assessments, complex case, and specialized assessments. She's also the author of the book, Explorations in Forensic Psychology, Cases in Criminal and Abnormal Behaviour, which found its genesis following the conviction and sentencing of disgraced Colonel Russell Williams. I met Dr. Watt when she presented at the 2017 IACA International Symposium in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she discussed the Russell Williams case study. We received such great feedback from our analysts that we invited her to present at our 2019 Calgary Symposium. Dr. Watt, thank you for agreeing to this interview and welcome to the channel.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Manny.
Your research involving Russell Williams was fascinating. What inspired you to conduct this case study?
Yeah, so it was a sort of serendipitous series of events, Manny, that resulted in my communicating actually with Russell Williams and composing the case study. For anybody who recalls, 2010 when Russell Williams was arrested and charged with the heinous crimes for which he was subsequently convicted, it was immediately evident this was a very unusual case, very unusual individual. I got contacted just like within days of his being arrested and charged, and I guess around his conviction. I was contacted by a book publisher from Toronto area that knew that I did complex, comprehensive assessments of correctional offenders. And they asked me if I would be, interested or would be up for the task of interviewing Russell Williams and maybe putting together a case study. So I ended up composing a letter with a colleague from Dalhousie University. We wrote a letter collaboratively together and invited Russell Williams, asked him if he would consent to an interview with me. And he politely declined. Politely declined because he had a lot of stuff going on. But he was and he promptly told me that I couldn't do a case study on him if he didn't agree to the interview. So I wrote back and I explained to him that I was going to do the case study whether or not he consented to the interview. And that sort of was the beginning of like a 3-year communication with Russell Williams and the case study and then the case study book.
It's an interesting read, and you certainly shared some fascinating insights I've never seen in any of the documentaries covering Russell Williams. We've had some lengthy discussions in the past about your communications or correspondence with Russell Williams. Can you share some of your findings and possibly include some details that you found intriguing?
Well, you'll know from looking at the book, Manny, that my interest in these cases and in the Russell Williams case, but in any of the cases that case studies that I do, my interest is impelled by that idea that it's very easy to denounce the evildoer, as Dostoevsky would tell us, but it's much more difficult to understand them. And as a professor and working with, undergraduate and graduate students, all the time, I'm always reminding them not to judge, not to label. Our job as psychologists or people interested in psychology is to understand, figure this out. So as a clinical psychologist, I come at cases like this from the perspective a clinical psychologist is trained to assess, diagnose, and treat. So you combine that with forensic psychology, which is everything at the interface of psychology and law. And so when I come to these cases, I don't want to just analyze, sort of the crime. I'm not interested, I'm interested in the crime scene. I'm interested in the criminal pattern of behavior and in what is impelling that. But I'm also very interested in how does this person end up committing this act? Like so how does Russell Williams at 46 years of age, the commander of Trenton Air Force Base, no criminal history that we were aware of at the time of his arrest. How does somebody like that end up getting charged and convicted for, sexually sadistic homicides, fetish burglaries, sexual assaults? Like, how does this happen? And that's the intriguing part. So you start digging in because Russell Williams wouldn't consent to an in-person interview. We did communicate, as I say, over 3 years, and so he didn't provide a lot of information. Um, so unlike if I went into a prison and did an assessment, you get access to a lot of information, file information, clinical interview, testing. That's what we do when we're doing an assessment. It's a very comprehensive process. In this case, I had to rely on what was available in the public domain largely for his background history, for his career, his occupational and interpersonal history. And then what I do is I take that and I compare what we know about him with the literature, the research literature. So, what does the research literature tell us about who does this sort of thing? And how does somebody like Russell Williams, how does he compare with others who have committed similar kinds of acts? How is he similar and how is he different?
So, how did you begin to classify Russell Williams' behaviors? At least the details of the behaviors that we know of. In law enforcement, some of us may have learned about sex offender classifications and offender typologies. What factors do you consider when examining someone like Williams?
Right. So, and again, because I don't have access to all, the collateral, all his personal information and key collateral information, I'm taking what I can get and I'm looking at what the research literature tells us. So, the literature, for example, tells us, first off, that he's very unique. That's what drew my attention, is that, and you would know this from your work, Manny, people don't just sort of wake up at age 46 and start committing, atrocious crimes. Typically, the typical pattern is that there is a pattern of criminal behavior over a period of time. So with Russell Williams, as far as we can determine, his criminal history only goes back 2-3 years, when he started doing, breaking into houses, um, stealing women's and young girls' underwear, filming himself, smelling the underwear, rolling around on the bed, lots of very sexually deviant behavior, very alarming behavior because most people had no idea that he had broken into their house. Um, so he's very unique in that regard, and that raises a lot of questions about how does a person, and yet, just to back up a bit, so he's engaging in behaviors that we know from the clinical research literature. Some of these behaviors would have been activated many years earlier. So somehow he's been able to control those urges and impulses. Um, for example, he admits that he became attracted to the idea of dressing up in women's clothing, especially women's undergarments, in his early 20s. Chances are it probably started even a little earlier than that. But somehow or other, he managed to control that part of his behavior as far as we know, um, for a long time. And dressing up in women's clothing is not a problem. Like, there's lots of people, more people than we know who are inclined to do that. It's not a problem until it, starts to create distress for the individual or distress for others. But he was unique in that he really lived, in many ways, a sort of model pro-social life, a very successful life for 45 years, 46 years. So that tells us about, this man has some skills, some abilities to keep a covert side of himself hidden.
So let's talk about that. This man is a top level commander in the Canadian Forces. To rise to that level of the
Yes.
military and fly under the radar, so to
Yes.
speak, this man
Yeah.
left no breadcrumbs. How does a deviant like that get past all the gates and rise through the ranks without anyone saying, this guy gives me the creeps?
Well, I think there's lots, again, I think in some ways, the fact that he was in the military, and oftentimes people with sort of those predilections, predispositions that Russell Williams has, are attracted to highly regimented and sort of very manly professions, right? Paramilitary organizations. Because that would allow him, then it's very structured, it's very disciplined, very compartmentalized. So it may have helped him with that need for control that he would have had. It's interesting that, yeah, I mean, he was, 23 years in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was happily married for, presumably so, for 18 years. He was an elite pilot. He's got pictures with the Queen. Flew governor generals around and prime ministers. So your question is great. Like, how does somebody like Russell Williams get to be so successful and nobody's got a clue? Nobody seemingly has a clue. And I would respond to that with some of his characteristics would serve him really well. He's narcissistic. I mean, so that's one of the personality characteristics that's quite prominent in this type of offender, is that, this grandiose sense of self-worth and self-importance, which we definitely tried to appeal to when we were writing and asking for an interview. So that self-confidence and that, sort of take charge, take control, um, personality attribute would serve him well in the military. That would demonstrate, that he could be a good leader. He's clearly bright, well educated. He has his master's, um, and he was seen to be a rising star. So I think people saw him as, if anyone found him, odd or abrasive or whatever, I think they may have just attributed it to his success, his, being a smart, ambitious, capable commander.
Do you think the fact that he was so prominent in the Canadian military, people around him may have just somehow, say, excused his behaviors that might otherwise be creepy, had he been just another guy? What do you think?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting, Manny, because we all know that we give over a lot to people who have either status, money, power. Um, we just think, they're successful, they've gotten this far. It can't, it must be just me that, I think maybe they're unusual. And it could be that there really was nothing outstanding in his presentation. And it may be that he kept very distant from others because they're certainly what we know about him is that he's a bit of a social isolate, but detached from others. So there may not have been a lot of opportunities to get up close and personal. And I doubt if anyone really knew Russell Williams very well. People may have had lots of interactions with him, but they may not have, clearly they didn't know Russell Williams well. I should share with you this, the Calgary conference. I got a message from someone who actually was friends with Russell Williams, who socialized with Russell Williams. And the individual was actually, quite indignant. She'd heard me interviewed on the radio in Calgary about the Russell Williams case, and she was quite indignant that I would have, the audacity to write a case study on him when I hadn't met him personally. And she said, because, if you knew him, he's a nice guy and, a good, she obviously had a really good opinion of Russell Williams. But of course, what was missing from her message to me was the fact that this man is convicted. Like, this is not, someone didn't make this stuff up. He wasn't falsely accused or falsely convicted. So this is a man that was able to present himself well and to maintain a facade that enabled him to be successful in his career and superficially with people.
In Russell Williams' history, he was already acting out somewhat. He was exhibiting some creepy behaviors. I mean, he was already, they attributed it to pranking, but this guy had a history of hiding in the closet. What do you make of that?
Yes.
This was his early years. I think this was when he was attending the University of Toronto.
Yes. So, yeah, great point. And when I present on this, or when I'm, teaching this case study with students, I talk about that because basically they were behavioral tryouts, right? So when I said he didn't have a criminal history except 2 or 3 years back, he actually he was engaging in behaviors that ended up being part of his criminal repertoire many years later. So what he would do, apparently, with roommates is he would hide in the closet for extended periods of time to jump out and surprise them. And as I say to students, or when I'm presenting this to an audience, I say, like, if someone does that to us, it might be funny once, not very funny twice. And if we were doing that to someone else, like, how long would we actually hide in a closet to get that effect? Not very long. Most of us would get very bored with hiding in the closet, and the reward of scaring our friend wouldn't be enough to keep us in there for long. So it's a disturbing, it certainly is a behavior that would, one would have to question. The other thing is he also apparently demonstrated some stealth in opening locks. So there were these clues, as it were, in his behavior early on that people just interpreted as being, that's just Russ.
Earlier, we were talking about how people may have excused weird or peculiar things he may have exhibited. It may be a big leap, but can it be tied to why he only has a known criminal history that spans a mere 3 years in the 11th hour of his life outside the penitentiary?
Yeah, so again, that comes back to he's a unique offender in that he was able to, because he's very bright. There's no question he's very bright. He's very skillful in ways. He followed a career that enabled him to maintain his facade and to have few people question it, right? Few people are going to question the commander of the Trenton Air Force Base. So he made and he was married. He had a, safe relationship, sort of part to his life. So he had lots of things that enabled him to have external controls on his behavior. And because he was, perhaps bright and skillful, he was able to maintain the internal controls because he had what we call paraphilias, right? Which are deviant disorders that are characterized by attraction to deviant sexual foci, right? Pedophilia is a type of paraphilia where people are attracted to minors. People can be attracted to clothing. People can be attracted to watching people undress or undressing them, exhibiting body parts themselves. And these are a class of disorders known as paraphilia. And he certainly has, and sexual sadism is a paraphilia, so he certainly has those, and those would have come online. He would have been dealing with them from adolescence. The research would suggest that that's probably something he was wrestling with since adolescence, or at least, something that he was acute, that he would have been aware of, but that wouldn't, he was able to control that aspect of his life um, for a long time. Many people aren't able to do that, right? The urges and the impulses are so overwhelming that they act out on them in ways that, bring them into conflict with the law.
Now, I've
But
watched, as I'm sure you have, the footage of Russell Williams' interview. The investigator conducted that interview with surgical precision. If there's such a thing as textbook, this was it.
Yes.
Detective Jim Smythe. What an amazing interview. What comes to mind are some of the other custodial interviews of sex offenders that I've seen. Let me ask you, do you consider Russell Williams a sexual sadist?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So that's one of the things that I proposed. So what I do in the case studies is I, collect all this information, I look at the literature, and then I speculate on what would be the disorders here. And so, yes, his behavior tells us he's a sexual sadist, right? So he's aroused by that, the stealth, the hunt, the cat and mouse kind of behavior, and then the control, the ultimate absolute control over another individual. So the sexual component, the sexual arousal is generated by that ultimate control and power that he exerts in that situation. So he's definitely a sexual sadist, but he's other things as well. And people who have paraphilias like sexual sadism generally have 4 to 5 other types of paraphilia. The transvestic fetishism, the attraction to dressing up in women's clothing, perhaps even, and I think this is probably true, aroused by the idea of seeing himself or thinking about himself as a woman. And of course, think about the contradiction there. You're in the military, uniform, manly man, and you're wearing women's underwear under your uniform, or you like that idea of having that on and other people don't know that. So it's a bit of a um, it's again, as paraphilias are defined, it's arousal to deviant sexual foci. In and of itself, that wouldn't be an issue, but it, feeds into a profile of a man who is increasingly aroused by the idea of breaking into people's houses, doing things, videotaping himself in all sorts of clothing, doing things that is clearly antisocial, and likes the idea that people don't know, right? People don't know that he's breaking in. People don't know what he's up to. People don't know that other side of him. So it's like living a whole life behind that facade that he takes to work at Trenton Air Force Base.
So he took pictures, and it wasn't just one instance. It seemed like, if not every victim, most of the victims, he would actually document with photographs. And he came prepared with a rape kit. What motivates this type of offender to risk being caught with the smoking gun? I've dealt with violent offenders that will risk everything to destroy evidence.
Well,
Is there an explanation for this? Is this a common behavior for a certain offender type to collect memorabilia like this?
Well, it's common with serial killers. And although Russell Williams, doesn't meet the sort of FBI criteria for serial killing because he only killed 2, he admits that he all but admits that he wouldn't have stopped he would have had to have been stopped.
Hey, if you're getting value out of this video, can you smash that like button? That'd mean the world to us. Now let's get back to the interview.
So I think, again, that's part of the thrill. And that goes back, Manny, to characteristics early in his life. He likes documenting. He's fastidious. He likes details. He likes numbers. He likes, the cataloging, the organizing, the recording is all sort of consonant with his personality. And then it also allows him to relive the thrill, right? To relive the thrill. And again, conveniently, now I don't know, for most of us, we don't have a room in our house that other people are not allowed to go into. But he did. And that is where, sort of the military structure kind of facilitated this because, his wife, nobody could go into this room because it was like top secret stuff. And that's where he kept all the recordings. All the clothing that he had stolen was in a room, that nobody could go into. So, there were lots of things that, it was like he had cultivated these inevitable crimes. He had cultivated those skills over a long period of time. He just hadn't acted on them.
In your book, under questions that remain to be answered, what intrigues me is question number 2, which is Russell Williams a psychopath? Give me your thoughts on that. Perhaps you can explain why that would not have been answered in your research.
Yeah. So, to begin with, when you look at the crimes of a Russell Williams, or, for example, in Nova Scotia more recently with the spree killer, people immediately, including, law professionals, legal professionals, police, FBI officers, one FBI officer said, was quoted as saying, well, you just look at the magnitude of the violence. Of course, he's a psychopath. And the fact is, you can't conflate those two. The criminality is not the same as psychopathy. Psychopathy is a personality or a characterological disorder. So, in order to determine, when we do assessments for psychopathy, it's a semi-structured interview with the offender. It's gathering a lot of collateral information, so file-based information or talking to people that would know. So in the Correctional Service of Canada, for whom I've done a lot of assessments, you have a lot of information from various people, parole officers, community, family members, etc. So you do the semi-structured interview, you do the file-based data, and then there's a measure, the psychopathy checklist, which was developed by Dr. Robert Hare, and it has 20 items that we as clinical psychologists are then charged with assessing. And the 20 items include, so we're asked to, based on all the information that we've gathered, we are asked to consider if the person, for example, demonstrates glib and superficial charm. So would that be a no, a maybe, a yes? Grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, impulsivity, irresponsibility. So there's 20 items that we have to go through, and we do it from an evidence-based, it's not just a judgment of what they're convicted for, right? So we have to go through that scale and then decide if the person meets a threshold for psychopathy. And that's a high threshold. Not a lot of people meet the threshold for psychopathy. And it includes two big factors. One is the interpersonal affective, the lack of remorse, lack of empathy, shallow affect, manipulative, conning, all those personality pieces. And the second factor is lifestyle, antisocial lifestyle. And this is where, you have people who live predatory existences, like not predatory parasitic existences. They tend to, live off other people. They're irresponsible. They don't hold down jobs. They demonstrate criminal versatility, meaning they, do a whole bunch of stuff. They fight at the tavern on Friday night, and then they steal here, and, they do all sorts of stuff. And the fact is that somebody like Russell Williams, if you look at his history, he doesn't have a lot of antisocial lifestyle. He had realistic goals in his life. He was a successful, he had worked successfully. He had completed university and a master's degree. So he had lots of indicators that he was, by all accounts, a pro-social, successful individual. He doesn't have a lot of the antisocial lifestyle pieces. So whether he would meet the threshold based on that, is a question. Even with the interpersonal affective, certainly his crimes tell us, indicate a lack of remorse, a lack of empathy. The second woman that he murdered, he had basically convinced her that he was going to let her go, and she's walking towards the door, and he kills her, and doesn't seem to be too distressed by that. Not as distressed as he was when his cat died, for example, which is when he did demonstrate apparently a lot of remorse, and his worries about his wife. He demonstrated a lot of concern in that interview with Jim Smith. He was very concerned about how upset his wife was going to be about her house being torn apart. Because Jim Smith told him, as we speak, Russ, your house is being torn apart. We're going to find all this stuff. And that was upsetting to him. So it's not that he was incapable of those emotions, but they were very compartmentalized, right? So sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
No, I was just going to say, so when we're assessing psychopathy, it's not a given. It can't be equated to the offense for which they're convicted.
Through the interview, you can sense that he had a high level of intelligence. Just the fact that he attained that rank in the military is certainly evidence of that. Is that a factor, or not a factor, but a characteristic of somebody that's a psychopath or a serial killer or a sex offender?
Well, you often hear people say that, right? That psychopaths are really intelligent. And I think we have to be careful that just because they're skillful in conning and manipulating and, lying without compunction, they can get away with things. They can elude custody, they can escape lots of situations, and that can look very intelligent. Like in Russell Williams' case, I don't think there's any question that, he's an intelligent man. That's demonstrated in lots of ways. But I don't think we can assume that intelligence is a sort of prerequisite or a natural correlate of psychopathy, because, of course, we do have lots of psychopaths who end up in prison, not the majority of incarcerated offenders by any means, but there's certainly psychopaths who end up in prison or who commit crimes in the community or just who mess up people's lives in the community. And they're not necessarily, any more intelligent than the average individual, but they do engage in behaviors that can make us look stupid, right? Because you know, um, so we sometimes think they're really much more skillful and clever than they are. They engage in behaviors that work for them. They can lie. They can look you in the eye and lie to your face, tell you whatever you want to hear. And for most people, the non-psychopaths, we find that hard to believe that somebody can do that, right? So we get caught. We can get caught.
I know that you've also studied deception detection and behavioral characteristics that might indicate deceit. Having watched the video interview of Russell Williams, what, if anything, can you tell me about what you saw that stood out in your mind?
Okay, well, I really liked that interview that Jim Smith did with him. So first off, and again, I know that detectives have these well scripted, right? They go into these interviews knowing what they're going to ask and knowing, they know how they want this to go. But they go in and it looks very congenial. In fact, I'm always struck. So each year I have the RCMP polygrapher come in and speak to my students, and I'm always struck by what I call the clinical presentation of a really skilled detective like that, or major crime person like that, because you have to establish rapport. You have to engage with the individual. There's no room for judgment there. That's not going to get you anywhere. You have to figure out how you're going to elicit information from this person, and how you're going to move this person towards a positive outcome, which in this case is a confession. And Jim Smith just does a beautiful job, right? He's so disarming, but very much in control of that interview. And Russell Williams knows it, right? And there is that point in the interview. There's different points which I thought were just so interesting. One is when Russell Williams knows that the gig is up, and he says, and I thought it was so interesting, he just immediately says, "Call me Russ." It was like shifting gears, right? So it's like I'm calling you, um, Mr. San Pedro, Mr. San Pedro, and then you go, "Call me Manny." And we're shifting gears, and now we're going to talk. Now we're going to be honest, right? So I found that interesting. Jim Smith, and I use it in my presentation on the case, says to Russell, and I actually use it with my students in teaching them about interviewing techniques, says to Russell Williams at the end of the interview, he says, "Have you thought about how all this happened?" And I thought, what a great way to ask that, right? So not, have you thought about why you did this? Because then you're assigning blame, right? You're putting him on the spot. But instead he does this third person, right? Like this sort of like, you know, have you given any thought to how this happened? And I thought that's really clever, because then it's just speculating, right? It's just speculating. And so there's lots of neat things. And again, these are the types of skills and the types of things that we do when we do clinical interviews for forensic risk assessment or complex case assessments. You have to learn, first off, you have to engage, you have to establish a relationship with this person. You can't just go in thinking of them as the other. You have to establish a relationship with them. You're in this interview together, just like we are, Manny.
It's interesting when you said that he sort of shifted gears once he said, "Call me Russ."
Yeah.
There's also in the letter you received from Russell Williams, in our discussion, as we were talking about it, there's a point in the letter where he shifts gears in a different way.
Yes.
Maybe you can talk about what that letter was, and then let's get into where he shifts gears. That's really what I'm interested in. What's your opinion or assessment of that shift?
Yeah. So, and again, I think this provides, it helps us to understand his compartmentalization, right? So he's, just like in the interview with Jim Smith is calling him Russell. He's not calling him Colonel, he's calling him Russell. And then when he shifts and Russell Williams says, "Call me Russ," he's taking down the facade. The facade drops. Russell Williams has maintained a facade for, most of his life. So in my communication with him over, I think, 3 years, and I have 13 or 15 letters from him. The one that I had mentioned to you before was the one once he realized that I was going to do this case study, whether he consented to the interview or not, he became very intrigued, and he wanted to read the case study when it was done. So I sent it to him, and in response, I got a 11 or 12 page, densely written, single spaced, not a mistake, handwritten, not a mistake, no scratching out, so it clearly had been written and rewritten, I would say. And the letter begins the same as all his letters begin, very officious, just as if he's the commander of the Trenton Air Force Base, or sometimes I would feel like he was the warden at, the penitentiary, just very official, very formal. Formal, but, friendly formal. So he starts off, and I, just commenting on the case study. And about 3 pages in, I start reading it, and it's just, his usual kind of style. And then about 3 pages in, he decides he wants to tell me how, yes, I realize you've put a lot of hard work into this case study, but you've sort of got it all wrong. And he starts critiquing, sort of challenging some of my conclusions. And again, to remind you, my conclusions are just, here's what probably is the case. Like I can't draw, definitive conclusions because I haven't interviewed the person, personally. But that's okay. So there's at about page 4 and into about halfway through page 5, the tone of the letter just changes because now he's attacking me. And you had very clever, like I had shared with you that when I started reading that, the first time when I received the letter, I just put the letter down. I thought, no, I'll read that when I'm in a mood to read Russell Williams, tuning me up for the case study. So I went back to it and I've since read through it. But there is this whole change in tone because now he's, and what struck me as unusual is that he didn't say anything about sexual sadism, about the any paraphilias. Of course, he chose not to admit to pedophilia, like he plea dealt not admitting to that, which also is intriguing. But anything about the murders, that didn't matter. What he got really upset about, it seemed, was my suggestion that he was socially awkward in some way, or that he wasn't socially skillful. And how could I possibly draw that conclusion? And of course, I'm just, talking about what the literature tells us about these individuals, that they tend to be detached from people, right? They tend to be emotionally and sometimes behaviorally isolated from people. And they may not be as skillful in the interpersonal domain. He took great offense to that, which I found, like, if I was going to pick the things I'd be offended by, that probably wouldn't have been it. But he was quite offended by that. And he, as I shared with you, he, said, like, how could you even suggest that, given that he'd been vetted through all those levels of the military, and they never would have allowed someone who was socially awkward to get to, commander of the Trenton Air Force Base. To which, of course, in my mind, I thought, well, yeah, but they allowed somebody who commits sexual homicide to get to commander of the Trenton Air Force Base. So clearly we're not, they can't vet everything. So he was very offended. And then the letter shifts back again. The tone of the letter shifts back again to his very polite, officious. And then he starts doing his orders, right? So could you get a student to photocopy all the articles that you've used and send them to me? And it's like, so treating me as if I'm his research assistant and I was to get some other research assistants and send him all the material. So very interesting, right? And again, it's that, this person who's very used to being in absolute control and in commanding his environment. And in compartmentalizing those aspects of himself. I can be very professional and official, but then, the door opens or you scratch the surface and there's this, very ugly underbelly. I mean, you may remember from my presentation, Manny, that he wrote letters to the victims' families. And you read those letters and they read like him just doing business. Like, despite the fact that he committed the offenses, the murders, which took away their loved ones, he writes letters which are just like professional letters. So sorry, you must be suffering, just want you to know that Jessica loved you and would have loved to have returned to you, just so really compartmentalized, operating in different domains at different times.
I'd love to invite you back to discuss with you in detail the contents of that letter. I've done some training in the past on scientific content analysis,
Yes.
analyzing statements, and one of the things that we look for is where things shift. That's why it piqued my curiosity when you said he shifted gears, because there's something behind that, and I'm curious to see what's surrounding that shift. What was he writing about before, during, and after that shifting? I'm curious. What do you think caused that shift?
Well, I will share with you, Manny, that after our previous conversation, I have decided that I'm going to submit that letter, and in particular that section, to some software that we use for analyzing linguistic and motivational content. So it's a text analysis software, and so we can submit text and analyze for different sort of affective words, cognitive words, biological words, interpersonal words. And so I am going to do that, and I will present those. I'll share those findings with you for sure.
Fantastic. I look forward to that. And my intent was to talk to you about a number of the other case studies in your book, because they're certainly interesting. The one involving Jerry Sandusky, it just drew my attention. I mean, the case study really focused on his wife, Dorothy. Yes, and I can see why.
It's my favorite.
I can see why it's very intriguing. I also wanted to discuss with you, I know it's on your list of future case studies, the Dellen Millard serial killings, involving the killings of Wayne Millard, Laura Babcock, and the highly publicized killing of Tim Bosma.
Yeah. That's definitely a case that I want to look at. I choose cases for unique features. So in the Jerry Sandusky case, as I like to say, Jerry Sandusky is in some ways like classic sex offender, classic profile of a person who offends in that, in a sexual manner and in that type. He's a type. We know lots of cases of people like Jerry Sandusky, but his wife is intriguing. As is Russell Williams' wife, right? As one person said, Russell Williams' wife demonstrated a remarkable lack of curiosity as to what her husband was up to when he went running at 1 o'clock in the morning. So, Bill Cosby's wife is another one, and it isn't, unfortunately, a coincidence that these are all women, in that they're women who have been married to men who have committed atrocious acts, and they have seemingly been quite willfully blind to indicators that there was something amiss, right? So it is an intriguing case. So that's probably my favorite of the cases in the case study book. The other one, of course, we've talked about is the Internet Black Widow. And when you talk about psychopathy, Manny, if you read that one, you'll see that she kind of hits a lot of the psychopathy criteria. Yeah.
Well, we're at that point.
Yeah.
This was a fascinating interview, and I certainly appreciate you taking a lot of time out of your busy schedule to join me today. And I know this will pique the curiosity of everyone watching this interview.
Oh, I hope so.
I'd like to keep in contact with you. I know you're busy with your research and teaching, but I'm seriously interested in reviewing that letter. And when you do start your work on the Dellen Millard murders, please make sure you reach out to me. I analyzed a series of cell phone records in that case, and you'll find some of the insights in the chronology to be very interesting and chilling. I also want to introduce you to one of the analysts, a former colleague of mine that was involved in the analysis of all the call detail records and cell phone contents from one of those homicides. If for nothing else, we can certainly provide you with insights that might otherwise not be available to you.
No, absolutely. I'd love to pick your brain and your collective brains about, that side of a case like this. Yeah. Dellen Lard is an intriguing case from a lot of different perspectives. Yeah.
Well, Margo, thanks again for a chunk of your time.
Okay.
I look forward to our follow-up interview.
Okay. Thanks, Manny.
That's Dr. Margo Watt, psychology professor, clinical forensic psychologist, author, and soon to be regular on this channel. Make sure you check out her book. You'll find the link in the description below. If you found value in this video, go ahead and smash that thumbs up. Click subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss any of our new episodes. Check out the links to additional crime analysis resources in the description and let us know what you think in the comments below. See you next time.